I'm still Dan Elitzer from IDEO, and maybe let's run quickly down the panel. We've got Muneeb, Juan, and Galen. Maybe just start off, I think we all know Muneeb and what Blockstack does. Maybe Juan and Galen, you want to introduce yourselves and your organizations?
Hey, my name is Juan. I'm the founder of coLAB. We make protocols like IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, and Filecoin, a decentralized storage network. We're a research, development, and deployment lab for all kinds of networks, and we're involved very closely with all of the kinds of things that you've been hearing about today in the decentralized world and the future of computing, or as we see it. There's a lot of future of computing stuff that you won't hear about today, but we think that this is one of the most important areas of computing, and now it's the right time to get involved.
Hey, I'm Galen. I work on a project called Urbit. Urbit is a ground-up personal server computing stack, so virtual machine programming language operating system that is your digital identity, runs your programs, stores your data. And we don't use a blockchain, so we're sort of stand out in that regard. But we sort of do everything else.
Okay, so since this is a storage panel, why would anybody want a decentralized storage solution? Why do current centralized systems not meet needs?
Should I go in? There's a lot of reasons why people might want this. One that is maybe very relevant here is control and trust. So when you use some service out there and you're trusting some entity to provide you that service, that means there's some sort of agreement and arrangement, whether it's legal or not, a legal agreement or not having that kind of agreement. There's this contractual nature to the service that means that the other side can probably sever that relationship whenever they want or whenever they're unable to continue providing that service. So decentralized storage networks create a cloud of service that allows any one individual service participants to kind of leave and come back without disrupting the service for everyone. So from a fault tolerance perspective, when you enable any storage provider to be able to fulfill your request, you can build more resilient things than even the current cloud. And that's kind of a crazy thought, right? Everybody thinks of the major cloud computing companies as so rock solid and stable that nothing could ever take them down. But we have seen this in the past. We have seen some of these have attacks and disrupt service, or be in a situation where they have to kick some service out because they don't agree with it or they're forced to or whatever. And decentralization here is really critical to build a computing fabric that you can trust because of its trustlessness, right? You can trust in a system, and you can trust that that system will continue working for you if the system itself does not trust in any individual third party. And that is one really key thing. Perhaps another is encryption at rest that's client-side, right? So being able to take all of your data, encrypt it yourself, and then give it to the cloud is a big difference between giving your data to the cloud in the clear, and then maybe they encrypt it, but they can still look at everything, right? And so that's a very important distinction that a lot of organizations really care about. So maybe we don't hear about it as much in Silicon Valley, but lots of people in the rest of the world, lots of organizations in the rest of the world care deeply about who has access to their data and who can look into all of it, and who can they turn it over to, and so on. Or it could get hacked. Some storage service could get hacked, and all of that data could leak. So those are at least two things. The most interesting one, I think, or one of the more interesting ones today, is the idea of marketplaces, right? Like being able to have all these storage providers come in together and form a marketplace that can drive the price of these services down and kind of cut out all of the business front end from the equation would enable much better optimization of service. So those are three different avenues where decentralized storage networks can do much better than centralized storage networks, and we'll probably see this play out over the next 2 to 5 years.
Well, so I very much buy the censorship-resistant argument, but in terms of lower cost, right? Folks like Amazon, Google, they're buying bulk hardware. They're able to do it at much lower cost than I, as a consumer, can. So, and you need more redundancy built into the system, right? They may have 2 or 3 copies. If you want to be super fault tolerant and distributed system, you need a lot more than that. So how do you actually get cost competitive with some of these more centralized services?
I think one really good observation is to look at what Bitcoin miners have done and how they've optimized their processes. And they've probably gotten better optimization in terms of like power consumption and their ASICs and so on that most storage companies have probably done in terms of how they store their own hardware. And like that's a huge claim, right? And so like I'm qualifying it with like, hey, this is probably the case, but we'll see. I think that once you get incentive structures put into place that make every participant, every individual and organization working hard to optimize that process, you'll see a whole bunch of pockets of optimization that are just not interesting to large centralized parties. Like there's a lot of things that the big players don't care to do that maybe small players can actually do, and as you add up, as you integrate over all of them, you might actually get something that's more optimal.
Yeah, I want to go back to the part about why decentralized storage is important. So the way we kind of look at it is that user data ends up becoming a way of lock-in, right? Like, for example, let's take Facebook. Everyone uses Facebook, and they think that this is free, but it's actually not. Facebook runs massive data centers, is actually doing a lot of work to manage all of that data, and what they're getting in return is data lock-in, like they own you. So as we start thinking about a completely decentralized internet, finding ways where users can have like their own almost like private cloud storage becomes extremely important, right? Because that flips the model where suddenly instead of like you giving your data to the apps are now writing data to you, right? And by default, you are the owner of all of your information, which is how real life works, right? Like this is how ownership works in real life. So, and coming to your second point about performance, I think it's a hard problem. Like this is all these large companies, some of them have like unlimited amounts of money and resources to throw at this problem. If Google can get like even a 1% efficiency in how they're storing data, that actually means like hundreds of millions of dollars to them. So, and they over the last decades, they've been attracting all of the best engineers, all of the best scientists. So this is going to be extremely hard because of the nature of the beast as well, right? Like because it's still a hard problem if you're a company, but if there's like no company in place and this is a protocol that should be able to function by itself, like the complexity there actually increases by a lot. But the good news is we already have solutions. Like you have IPFS, like you have Blockstack storage system, Gaia, you have other storage systems. So multiple people are actually like taking a stab at this, and we already have working solutions.
I think that brings up the thing that's most exciting to me, that I think actually changes the market dynamics a little bit. That basically, if you do this in a decentralized way, as a developer or as a designer, as someone who might build something, it's way more interesting to me to build something where the user actually retains their data and can trust where that data is stored. So I think the lever here is like the market dynamics might be the market might be very difficult to beat as it presently stands, but it sort of doesn't, what matters most is that people actually are excited about the things that can be built on these platforms. And that lever is extremely powerful, I think, in changing the way this game works.
So what do you see as being some of the things that you'd be most excited to see built on these decentralized storage platforms that we wouldn't really see on traditional centralized platforms?
Sure. I think one example is like this is a pain point I personally felt. Like I started writing on Medium last year, and then they would just like insert like these links to other posts from other authors, which just felt like adding ads on like my blog. And then like they wouldn't even let me edit like a small thing in HTML, like where I just wanted to quickly fix something. But I was still there because of the distribution network they had, right? So now imagine that back in the 90s, people, if you wanted to start late 90s, you wanted to start a blog or your website, you would just host your own server and host it there. But that's also painful. Like you have to maintain the server and so on. So a reliable decentralized storage system could actually be the key thing to unlocking an app where you can have a decentralized blogging platform that is as easy to use as Medium, but you actually store the data on your storage. And that's from where everyone is actually reading the information.
What I would like to see is a social network that has better privacy guarantees, where you're able to have communication with a set of other people and actually control the sharing very carefully. I think that's something that humans right now are not used to, and kind of surprised now that they don't have this. But more importantly, I think the feature there that is really missing is fault tolerance. So today, all of these centralized systems are in a position where if your connectivity, like you could have your phone, right now we have a room full of people, right? And everyone has computers on them. We probably have 2 to 3 devices per person now, and it's probably going to increase as wearables make it out and so on. If we get disconnected from the backbone and we can't talk to Facebook servers, suddenly all of our communication platform shuts down completely. We can't talk to each other. We can't send messages. We can't communicate with people in the other room or even in this room. And that's absurd. And I think that what we are building now enables applications that would work even despite those failures, where you can have social networks and collaboration platforms like group messaging or individual peer-to-peer messaging that works in that fault-tolerant regime where it doesn't matter if you can't connect to the backbone, you can still reach people. This is particularly important in the developing world where connectivity is not so great, where it's spotty, where the bandwidth is really good locally but not so great to the rest of the world, and where there have been many cases of parties censoring entire populations. And that's absolutely not okay. The internet is this great equalizing force that brings in the ability to communicate with anybody. And that equalizing force is getting disrupted by the fact that anybody can just come by and cut one wire, and then suddenly everything shuts down. And that's just going to change.
I think one of the kind of intermediate applications that would be really great to see, but is actually quite difficult to build, is that Google, Facebook, I think there are. I wonder if Medium does. I'm not sure if Medium does this. Allow you to export your data, right? So big companies kind of pander to this idea, and we all know that if anyone's ever downloaded that zip, it's completely inscrutable. So what I'd really like to see is someone who would figure out a way to basically normalize that data and then store it in some kind of decentralized storage platform. And that's something that could be done now that I think would provide a kind of easy exit onto whatever that next thing might be. And people have kicked around this idea a little bit, but it was, I think, a little bit pre-IPFS, pre-really good solutions to this. And I feel like there's something there that could be done that would be really, really great to see.
So one of the things you mentioned was the idea of encrypting data before sending it out, right? But I think we've talked about it, and I think one of the tenets for Blockstack is you don't want to put data on the blockchain that you don't have to. Anything sensitive you don't want out there, even if it's encrypted, right? It's still risky. So how can we still feel safe then having a bunch of computers and users that we don't trust storing our data even if it's encrypted? Isn't that still opening ourselves up to some security issues?
This is a policy thing, right? You can associate policies with data and say, I want this data to only live in a set of parties or a set of nodes, whether that may be just your devices and that's it, or it could be devices managed by others. I think that where we're headed is that individual humans will have many devices, and maybe you might have a home device and so on, but still a lot of the content that you produce, especially in social networks, especially in communication systems and so on, is going to get hosted by a whole bunch of other parties that are not specifically you, but that you may trust to do so for you. And how we classify those policies and how we express them is a UX question. It's a big one of how can you make it easy for people to say, oh yeah, the trust circle that I want to be able to host and distribute my data should be this one and not some much wider one. And that's something that I think will come with time.
It's almost at another layer, right? It's like a key management problem. It's not just I feel like it's almost a layer violation. You want that to happen at some other layer.
Yeah, I can tell you what we do at Blockstack, right? So as you mentioned that we don't want to put a lot of data in the blockchain. So the blockchain basically just has a pointer, and then for various technical reasons that I wouldn't go into, there's a peer network that has another pointer to the actual data that is encrypted. So we treat providers like Dropbox or Amazon or Google as dumb hard drives. Just you don't know who your hard drive manufacturer is on your laptop, because there are drivers that you can plug in another hard drive and it doesn't matter, you can just write data there. So we're reducing all these cloud providers to basically dumb hard drives, and we have written drivers for a bunch of them. So you put encrypted data there, which means that their engineers or anyone else can't look at the data. And the question you're asking is that what happens if someone gets a copy of the encrypted data? Would they be able to decrypt it some point later in time? Yes, that's a possibility, and that's where some of the policy decisions come in, right? Like, one is your protection against the actual provider. The provider can see the encrypted blob, right? But you can actually make your data still not discoverable in the sense that it's kind of private to you. Let's say it's a private journal app that I'm using. So I'm not exposing that data to the full internet. And we can also try to make these protocols like future-proof. Like, for example, you should be able to upgrade the encryption algorithm at some point, right? So your data stays the same. You re-encrypt it with a new algorithm, and you always like push the boundary to where an algorithm could actually be cracked, and you always keep it to 5 to 10 years or more, right? So this is like, these are some of the things that are hard problems, but with getting the right people involved and having the right architectures, like I truly believe that they're solvable.
So speaking of kind of permissioning and how this is working, what do you see as the defaults? How should we be thinking about for the average user using this to do their own journal, to have a social network? What are the appropriate defaults for storage in that setting in your mind?
I can start on this, and my feeling about maybe something that's very different about decentralized projects is that they're not competitive for user lock-in, right? And so I think that from the user standpoint, well, from both the developer standpoint and the user standpoint, a developer may pick a service that they like, and a user doesn't care, they just want to store data. And so I think at the end of the day, I'm not sure if you're asking about defaults in terms of privacy, but in terms of like what are the best places to put this data, I think basically it's like your hard drive and there's just a cord that you hook up and the developer picked the service that they liked. Maybe the user can say, no, you know what, I'd rather store this in IPFS and not in Dropbox. I mean, it shouldn't, at the end of the day, it sort of shouldn't matter. And that's like the point is that we should layer over these things and like make these distinctions like not super important. Perhaps if the user wants to like drill down to that level, it's possible, but it shouldn't make a difference. Like, it shouldn't matter.
I think there are many differences when it comes to different applications and like the thread models they imply. So being able to communicate and broadcast with something like Twitter where you want to be able to say something to the whole world is very different than, say, email, or is very different from the private journal. Right? So these different applications will have different thread models, and that will imply a different policy. So you could have some default policies associated with these applications that say, oh yeah, this private journal app, by default, it only stores on your devices, and that's it, and nothing else. But like you said, it would be useful to then potentially be able to switch that, or vice versa, right? I want to have something like Twitter, but I only want to have it with the close group of people that I interact with, and no more, right? And so those kinds of modalities I think will be baked into both the applications with defaults and with some amount of UX there. There's a whole bunch of UX challenges here that I think are probably underestimated. So I think what we're seeing right now is the rise of a completely different way of looking at how we organize both computing and storage. And a lot of the concerns around confidentiality and privacy and security and so on are finally, we can finally address them with good hard tech. But the UX side of this, like making applications correctly translate all of that, reduce that complexity so that for the user it's a very, very simple, intuitive interface, is a very hard challenge. And I think that's one of the reasons a lot of the world hasn't yet, or a lot of the Silicon Valley tech world hasn't yet understood or valued the blockchain tech world. It's because the UX is not yet there for consumer products. But the moment that you have an amazingly good consumer product that's decentralized, that is clear with how and where this data is stored, that the sharing is clear and controllable by the user, that's a tipping point that where we'll see a whole bunch more interest in this area and a whole bunch more applications being built. So
I feel like this is a really important question, so I'll chime in a little bit as well. I feel this is important because the defaults end up being the thing that most people do, right? And if you would look at what happened with the internet in the last couple of decades, the default was actually let's just get all the data from the users and we'll try to make use of this data later on. Or let's opt them into things that they are not even realizing what this thing is, right? So I feel like actually last year there was a great event in San Francisco, the Decentralized Web Summit, and over there I highly recommend this talk by Corey. And over there he was talking about, Sir Tim Berners-Lee was there, Windsurf was there, and he was talking about this moment that, hey, if we truly believe that we are rewriting the internet, and this is going to be a new system, then we have tremendous responsibility to make sure that we are very careful about the DNA of this new internet, right? That we are extremely careful that whenever we are picking defaults, it might seem like a small thing, but we always have to make sure that we are protecting the users. That the default answer is always that the power should be with the user, and whenever we are making any policy decision, it could be about our backdoors allowed, or who has like IP right on certain things. Like we have to make sure right now to do things correctly, because this will impact people 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when they will be pointing out problems in the things that we created today.
It's pretty heavy. So what are some examples of either projects or specific applications that you see that you feel like these folks are doing it right, or they're headed in the right direction? We want more folks to build applications in this style.
I think one that comes to mind right away is OpenBazaar. For us, like we've been working closely with them, and they're doing a lot of this kind of stuff, very carefully and thinking about the trust model and how things get distributed and how information flows and all that. There's a million and one challenges, and there's a ton of stuff that they're taking on with they have a small team and they're like taking on these massive challenges, and I don't think they get enough credit for that. I think that they're doing like awesome work there, and there's a lot more to go. So I think we're gonna have to be patient for the next year and 1 to 3 years, as a lot of these applications start understanding how this new model and medium works, as we figure out the UX, as we figure out the challenges, both technical, security-wise, and just consumer area, like how do you get a lot of this stuff adopted? So I think that's one group. I think another set of interesting groups are just, this is less related to blockchain tech and more around private messaging. There's a lot of really solid groups thinking about encrypting everything beforehand in the client and having a really solid, very carefully composed and audited, ciphers and so on. Signal is a great example of this. That they think very carefully about the model, the distribution of the data, where do the ciphertexts go, what are all the timing attacks involved there, and so on. And that's another group that I think is doing things very carefully and in the right direction. And I think over time we'll get more and more of these groups doing it. But it also requires really good, really solid consumer pressure. So I think it's getting to a tipping point with consumer products to the point where there's some application that people just want to use, not because it's private or privacy-oriented, but just because it's so good and it has some important key characteristic that drives consumers there, and that just brings an influx of attention and revenue to these groups, and that'll be a really nice beachhead to then move and move forward the entire space. Similar to how it happened with social networks in the first place. When the first social networks started gathering steam and interest, suddenly, in a few years, we suddenly got identity on the web. Before social networks, the internet was this pseudonymous place that was very, very different. And then, a few social networks kind of established a beachhead, and then they brought identity, to the internet in a big way, both for good and bad, right? There's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of really good things about having very clear identity on the web. There's also a lot of dangers too. So we'll look forward to see how all of this develops.
It's very early. I think that's it's very, very early. I think the Status project is quite good. The Status Ethereum project. The UI UX there is such that you really wouldn't know what's going on behind the scenes, which is a good bar, I think, for people to aim at. But it's so early.
Awesome. All right, well, I'm getting the flag. Okay. So thank you. Very, very informative panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.